Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Cathy Hannabach, and I'm the president of Ideas on Fire. And you are here for a webinar on turning your dissertation into a book. I saw from the folks that are registered, a lot of you are deep in the middle of this process yourselves. We've been working with you on editing that and consulting with you on how you can best do that. I know some of you are not quite there. I know there's some grad students who are here, which is awesome. You're thinking ahead. That's fabulous. And for those of you whose names I didn't recognize on the registration list, welcome. I hope you will join us for some more webinars. As I said, I'm the president of Ideas on Fire, and we're an academic editing and consulting agency working specifically with interdisciplinary academics. We provide editing and indexing services for books and journals. We provide teaching and workshop series such as this one that you're in here. And we also run Grad School Rockstars, which is a mentorship community for interdisciplinary graduate students. So I'm very excited for this. A couple of logistical announcements before we jump in. If you notice on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a chat function. If at any time during the webinar itself you have a question that you want answered, you can either put it in the chat over there, or you can use the Ask a Question button that's down at the bottom of your screen. There'll be time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that you might have. So if you have any that come up for you during the presentation, go ahead and put them either in the chat or in the Ask a Question section, and I will be sure to get to them. So I am going to share my screen and we will jump in. Let's see, here we go. Make sure this is working. Great. Okay, so we're going to be talking about turning your dissertation into a book. Now, before we jump in, I want to warn you that not all dissertations need to become books. There's often the assumption that your dissertation will eventually become a book, and a lot of advisors, a lot of graduate programs, and a lot of even publishers sometimes assume that. But that's not necessarily the case. Every dissertation doesn't need to or can really become a book, but many of them do. And so we'll be talking today about the dissertations that do lend themselves to becoming books in a revised and updated form, and how you can actually go about doing that, and as well as locating a publisher that fits with the topic that you're writing about. So what's on tap today? We're going to start off talking about why dissertations are not already books. We're also going to talk about when you start the revision process, you've figured out your dissertation would make a good book with some serious revisions. What do you need to reduce or cut out of the existing draft to make it a book that publishers would be interested in? We're also going to be talking about the things that you'll need to add. This is new material that you'll need to provide in the manuscript itself to turn it from a dissertation into a book. We're also going to talk about some tricky issues or troubleshooting things, if that language makes more sense to you. These are some of the challenges that come up in the revision process. Some of them are going to be particular to you, so not everyone will experience them, but a lot of these are very, very common. And so we'll talk about what some of those common challenges are and what are some solutions for tackling them. And then finally, we're going to close out by talking about why editors are your best friends in this revision process. And we're going to talk about what editors can provide, why editors are necessary, the different types of editors that you have access to in your life, and how you can best use editors to revise your dissertation into a book. So let's start off with the difference between dissertations and books. Now, some of you might think that this is kind of old information. Of course, dissertations aren't books, right? But oftentimes graduate students think that they've written maybe 90% of a book when they've completed their dissertation. They might think that they have a few little revisions here or there to make. Maybe that topic I didn't get to, or that chapter I didn't get to add might need some updating. Maybe the citations need a little bit of updating. But in general, I have maybe 90% of a book with my finished dissertation. I'm going to say that is absolutely not true. And it's one of the most kind of pernicious myths, and it's something that publishers definitely want graduate students to be aware of, that dissertations are not books. So let's talk about why. So dissertations and books have different objects, authors, audiences, lengths or structure, different elements, and they also have radically different goals or measures of success. Dissertations are, depending on your field, but generally across the board, this plays out. Dissertations tend to be intensely focused. They're meticulously researched, and they focus on a specific scholarly phenomenon or question. It's your chance to make an intervention into a specific scholarly field. In contrast, books are a sustained critical inquiry into something that has broader significance. Rather than just focusing us on a single scholarly question like a dissertation, a book needs to speak to broader patterns. It needs to speak to cultural, political, economic, and or social concerns that a wide swath of people are going to be interested in. The author of a dissertation is by definition a student. In contrast, the author of a book is a grown-up scholar. And we're going to talk about how that identity shift, which is a big identity shift that you have to go through this revision process, we're going to talk about how that identity shift can shape the revision process itself. The audience for dissertations and books are also radically different. And this affects how these two different types of manuscripts are structured, as well as the content that's in them. The audience for a dissertation is extraordinarily small, right? The people who read your dissertation, even the most fantastic dissertation on the planet, that number of people is extremely small. The primary audience for a dissertation is your dissertation committee. Depending on your program, that might be anywhere from 3 to 5 committee members. But either way, we're talking about literally a handful of people. They're the audience that you're writing for when you're writing a dissertation. They're who you're trying to anticipate their needs. They're who you are trying to please. They're who you are trying to tap into things that they're interested in. They're who you're responding to, right? That very small audience for your dissertation committee, they are paid to read your dissertation. It's part of their job, right? As professors, that's part of what they get a salary to do, which is advise graduate students. And part of that is serving on dissertation committees and reading student dissertations. So readers are paid to read a dissertation manuscript. In contrast, books have audiences that are much, much broader. Book audiences include scholars across a large number of fields, not just the field that you got your degree in. Book audiences include broad readerships interested in the specific topic, as well as surrounding topics that your book touches on. Book audiences include undergraduates, an audience that you probably never thought of when you were writing your dissertation, because undergraduates by and large do not read dissertations. Book audiences include graduate students, faculty, members of the public who are not academics, as well as other kinds of scholars who are interested in that topic. In contrast to your dissertation, which readers are paid to read, right? Your committee members are paid to read your dissertation. Books go the opposite way. Readers have to pay to have access to them. This radically different form of audience and their very different relationship to the manuscript is a big reason why dissertations are not already books. Because dissertations were not written for a book audience. They were written for a dissertation audience, which is what you're supposed to do. So part of the revision process that we're going to be talking about today is learning how to turn a manuscript that was written for 3 to 5 committee members who have to read it to a manuscript that is going to appeal to a broad range of readers who have to go out of their way to obtain, pay for, and read this manuscript. Dissertations and books also have length differences. This depends on your field and depends on your university, but most programs don't have page length requirements for dissertations. Sometimes there might be a minimum requirement. It can't be less than X number of pages, but a lot of times programs have no upper limit. And this is one reason why dissertations are often huge. They're usually much larger than the books that they sometimes turn into, precisely because they don't have those kinds of page limits. In contrast, books have hard page limits. Those are set by the publisher, not by authors. Different publishers have different length requirements. They have different reasons for this. Most books, not all, of course, but most are around 200 pages. So when you're aiming for a book-length manuscript, you're talking about writing around 200 pages. Now, some fields, the books tend to be longer than that. For instance, history tends to have longer books than some other fields. But by and large, most books are not shorter than 200 pages. The reason for these different page length requirements between a dissertation and a book is that dissertation page counts aren't affected by cost. Book page counts are. More pages in a book equals higher production costs. Now, some people think that that refers to the actual printing of pages, and that's certainly part of it. Paper costs money. Typesetting costs money. But now that we're working with largely digital-based production processes and workflows, the production costs that get raised with more pages actually pertain more to labor. When books are higher, when a book with a page count of books is higher, it takes longer amounts of time for the various people who have to work on that book to do that work, which means that the longer your book is, the more expensive it is for a publisher to produce. Academic publishers, as some of you are well aware of, are severely underfunded. So publishers have to care about how much it costs to print your book, how much it costs to shepherd your book through the production process. Now, those cost implications, those are not something that your dissertation committee is really concerned with. They don't need to be. But when it comes to publishing a book, publishers have to focus on those things, which means that as an author, you do too. There are also different elements in a dissertation versus a book. The specific elements are going to depend on your field and your department, but by and large, most dissertations have some version of an introduction. They usually have a very, very large literature review that can come in the form of a literature review chapter or literature review sections scattered throughout the text. Dissertations often have very, very large methodology sections or chapters. They have body chapters. They tend to have a lot of images and figures, particularly if you're dealing at all with anything visual. You tend to have a large list of them. They often have appendices, and they tend to have tons and tons and tons of citations. These are things that dissertations should have because of what they're intended to do. The reason why dissertations tend to have lots of citations, for example, is because this is a manuscript in which your job as an author is to demonstrate field mastery. And that requires demonstrating that you have read, you've understood, you can synthesize, and you can put to use the key texts, concepts, and authors in your field. You have to explain, what does Foucault mean by biopower? Because you're demonstrating that you understand him. In contrast, a book doesn't need that type of explanation. So the elements of a book would include front matter. This would include the table of contents, title pages, acknowledgement sections, table of contents. They can also include prefaces. They're going to include an introduction chapter, which is not a body chapter. They're also going to include body chapters. They're going to include back matter, which is your works cited, your endnotes, and your index. They're also going to include fewer images and figures, and I'll talk about why in a minute. They're going to include only the relevant citations. Instead of demonstrating that you have mastery over a field, a book is only going to include the citations that are relevant to the specific argument that it's making. And that's because its author doesn't need to demonstrate field mastery in the same way that a student author of a dissertation does. And books also are going to include a much, much reduced, as well as redistributed and better integrated literature review and methodology sections. And we'll talk specifically today about how that works. I want to go back to this issue of images and figures. So in a dissertation, by and large, dissertations are not published. Sometimes people file their dissertations with digital archives that are available and you can download people's dissertations through them, but that's not considered publishing. Because dissertations are not published, copyright works differently. So you can include a lot of images and figures in your dissertation because copyright applies in a different manner. In a book, you have to pay for those images and figures if they are under copyright. Because of that, this is not something you need to deal with in a dissertation, but you do need to deal with when you want to revise that dissertation into a book. And that's one reason why books contain so many fewer images and figures than the dissertation versions that they emerged from. And finally, dissertations and books have radically different goals and measures of success. The goal of a dissertation, its reason for existing, how you know if you wrote a good one, is that you got your PhD. That's its job. Its job is to get those 3 to 5 committee members to sign off on your PhD. If you did that, it was a successful dissertation. A book, in contrast, has a much broader and more public goal. Books need to meaningfully contribute to collective thought. They need to give readers a productive tool for changing something in the world. They need to be taken up by readers who are going to do things in the world with them. These are not the goals of a dissertation, right? But they are the goals of a book. And so these key differences in object, in author, in audience, in length, in elements, and measures of success and goals that differentiate dissertations from books are a key way that dissertations are not books already, ever. You could have written the most amazing dissertation on the planet, and it's still not a book yet. That's okay. It can be. So how do you actually do that? How do you turn a dissertation into a book? The first thing you're going to think about are the things that you need to reduce or cut. The biggest dissertation to book shift that you'll experience is a focus on audience. Now, if you remember, I was talking a little bit earlier about how audience isn't a super key focus when you're writing a dissertation. The audience for your dissertation is really small. You know them. You know the 3 to 5 people. You meet with them regularly. You know what they want. You know which authors they like. You know which terminology they like. You know which pet theories they have. And you can write specifically for them, right? You don't need to think about anyone beyond that, really. In contrast, a book needs to focus on broad audiences. Now, this makes your writing better. It's why books are better than dissertations. It's why they're more pleasurable to read. It's why they're smarter. It's why they're a much better version of the thought that originated in a dissertation version. And it comes down to audience. So when you're thinking about how to frame your book for broad audiences, that will shape the things that you reduce, cut, or add. So the first thing to go, and you might have heard this in other books or other courses that teach you about this dissertation to book process, the first thing to get cut when you're shifting from a dissertation to a book is your literature review. Now, in dissertations, depending on your field, for instance, in the social sciences and sciences, your literature review might be a single chapter. It might be consolidated that way into a single location in your manuscript. Those of you in the humanities and the interdisciplines, your literature review might be spread out across the manuscript, right? Humanities and interdisciplinary fields tend to not cordon off literature reviews into single chapters. So you're going to need to dig into your text and go find all of the literature review sections, right? Those of you in the social sciences or sciences, you have this a little easier because you know exactly where that chapter is, and you can just hit delete. Now, when I say you're deleting this, I don't necessarily mean you're literally throwing everything away that you ever analyzed some other scholar saying. What I am saying is that you don't need to, in a book version, do the student exercise of explaining what well-known theorists have said about anything related to your topic. That's appropriate for a dissertation. That's good in a dissertation because you're demonstrating that you understand this field. In a book, a reader who's reading a book by a scholar, which is the author of a book, not a dissertation, we already assume you're an expert in this field. You don't need to rehearse what every famous scholar has ever said about everything in a book version, in the same way that you would in a dissertation. So literature review is one of the first things to get reduced or cut. Extensive discussions of methodology is also a big thing that gets reduced or cut when you're moving from a dissertation to a book. Now, yes, books should mention methodology. Every book needs to explain to readers how you studied the thing that you studied. What methodology did you use? How did you find the people that you interviewed if you interviewed people? What texts did you analyze if you did textual analysis? What specific archival materials did you focus on if you focused on archival materials? Yes, methodology should be in a book, but it needs to be a relatively small section of the book. It usually gets put in the introduction. It's usually a section of the introduction, and we're talking a few pages at most. Now, this will vary by field, and some particularly social science fields might have more extensive methodology sections than humanities fields or interdisciplinary fields. But the methodology section from a dissertation is going to be much, much larger. And that's because a methodology section in a dissertation often functions as a secondary literature review. In a dissertation, student authors often explain all of the methodologies in their field and why they picked the one that they did, as well as why they didn't pick the ones that they didn't. That's great for a dissertation. Again, you're demonstrating that you understand this field, that you have mastery over this field, that you know how people in this field study things, right? Which means you're also explaining the various methodologies available in your field. Now, chances are you're not using all of those methodologies, but you're still explaining how they work in your dissertation. In a book, you don't need to explain the stuff that you're not doing. You need to keep your focus on the stuff that you're doing. So the methodology sections that are about all of these fabulous other methodologies that other people in your field are employing, but you didn't, all of that gets cut for the book version. Readers need to know in the book version how you studied the thing that you studied, and then what you have to say about it. Another thing that gets severely reduced or cut when going from dissertation to book is an excessive reliance on other scholars' voices. Now, this is related to the literature review issue as well. So in a dissertation, by definition, the author is a student, right? You are, by and large, deferring to the voices of others. You're learning how more senior scholars in your fields have thought about particular issues. You're finding a gap, you're finding what you could uniquely contribute to that. But by and large, dissertations focus on the voices of others. Again, this goes back to that field mastery issue. In contrast, a book needs to foreground the voice of the author whose name is on the cover. That author's voice needs to be the strongest and loudest voice in the entire text because it's your book. It's not Foucault's book. It's not Judith Butler's book. It's not Sarah Ahmed's book. It's your book. So your voice needs to be primary across the entire text. And this is something that you're not largely worried about in the same way in a dissertation. Another thing that gets reduced or cut when going from dissertation to book are giant endnotes and footnotes. Again, also related to this literature review question. And I mentioned briefly a little bit before, justifications for why you did or didn't do something. In a dissertation, this makes a little bit of sense depending on your field and depending on how it's framed, where you're explaining to your committee why you did or didn't do something. But in a book, you don't need to justify that. Just do it. You're the author of the text. You're an expert in this topic. It's why you wrote a book about it. It's why a publisher bothered to publish a book by you about it. You're already an expert. So just claim what you want to claim about it and leave the justifications back in the dissertation version. Explanations of why you got interested in the topic or defensiveness about the topic is also something that marks a dissertation that needs to come out for it to turn into a book version. Instead of focusing on why you personally got interested in a topic, which might be fine for a dissertation. Why did you get interested in this? In a book version, you need to focus on the reader. So instead of saying why I, the author, found this interesting, how I happened to stumble into this topic, instead explain why the reader should care. Why should the reader care about this topic? What did they get out of it? And that's a big disc to book shift that has to do with the audience. And then I also I mentioned earlier, extensive images and figures. They cost money. Copyright is a pain to track down. So it behooves you to reduce that as much as possible for the book version. You're also going to be adding significant new material to the book version. And again, remember, the focus here is on audience. Who is going to buy this book? The primary new thing that gets added to books that started out as dissertations is a brand new frame. A frame is the kind of lens through which a reader experiences your text. Think of it as literally a picture frame. It's the thing through which a reader sees what you've presented them with. A dissertation frame is often kind of flimsy, and that's okay. It doesn't need to be super strong in the dissertation version, right? Again, because audience isn't really a primary concern. You don't have to hook the audience in any way. They're paid to read your thing, right? In a book version, you do need to hook your audience. You need to draw them in. You need to give them some reason to read. You need to give them some reason to buy your book, right? So that new frame is how you do that. You're also probably going to be writing a new introduction chapter. I recommend, and with the clients that we work with at Ideas on Fire, who in terms of editing, we recommend you throw out your existing introduction and write one from scratch. And the reason for that is because it's often easier to do that from scratch than it is to revise an existing dissertation introduction, because your brain still gets stuck in that old frame. The new frame that you're creating for your book version often requires a brand new introduction, because the introduction is where you present your argument for the text, you explain your methodology, and you present that frame, right? And if your frame and argument have transformed dramatically, which they probably will when you're making these revisions, it means that you need a brand new introduction chapter to present that information. And it's usually easier to write that from scratch. You're also going to need to add updated references and citations. Depending on how long it's been since you finished your PhD, this might need more or less. If you finished your PhD 2 months ago, you're going to have less work on the updating of references and citations, but you're still going to have some. On the other hand, if you finished your PhD several years ago, you're going to have a lot more of this work, because a lot more scholarship has been produced and published and debated and used in that time period. You also might need to add expanded references or citations to speak to the new audiences that you're pitching your book to, right? For instance, you might be pitching your book to audiences beyond the disciplinary field that you got your degree in which case you're going to need to provide and actively engage with scholarship that comes from those expanded fields in the text itself. For instance, if your degree is in sociology, you got a PhD in sociology, but your book is being pitched to people in women and gender studies, in cultural anthropology, in communications and media studies, your citations and your engagement with ideas needs to reflect those new fields as well. And so those are things that you might need to add to the book version as you're doing your revisions. And then finally, you're going to need to update if, and this will depend on your topic, you're going to need to add updated current events. Obviously, things will have happened in the world between when you finished your PhD or when you finish your dissertation and when your book comes out, right? Those things need to be updated for the book version. And don't think that this only refers to people writing about super current events, right? Obviously, you're going to need to update when you're referencing presidential elections, or if you're referencing a specific ad campaign or a company. If the company no longer exists or had some big change to it, or there's a new person in a leadership position that you refer to, that kind of stuff needs to be updated. But even if you're writing about historical fields, like let's say your field is medieval studies, obviously things aren't currently happening in medieval times right now, but they are happening in medieval studies as a field. So even if you're writing about historical events, that the events themselves are not going to change in the time period between when you finish your degree and when you publish a book, the scholarly and public conversations about those events will have changed. And so you need to make sure that you update that in the book version. So let's talk about some tricky issues when it comes to revising your dissertation into a book. One of the primary reluctances, let's say, or challenges that a lot of authors have when making this transition is a reluctance to cut material. Now, I understand this so much. I identify with this intensely. I get it. Dissertations are freaking hard to write, especially considering you've never written anything that long in your life, right? It was the first time you ever wrote a dissertation for most of you. For those of you with multiple PhDs, not talking about you. It's hard to cut material that you sweated over, that you spent so long producing. But cutting material is how you make texts good. Every single author who's ever published anything, whether it's a blog post, whether it's a book, whether it's a journal article, whether it's a newspaper article, anyone who's ever published anything has thrown material away. It is normal. It is crucial to the editing process. There's a very famous William Faulkner quote about writing and about the kind of pain of writing, the trauma of writing. And he says that one of the primary kind of things that you do as a writer is you kill your darlings. And there he's talking about the kind of darlings here is that material that you are super emotionally attached to, right? You worked really hard on it. Maybe it was really difficult to write. Maybe you had maybe it came out of a very meaningful moment in your life. Maybe you have other kinds of emotional attachments to it. But part of what he's pointing out here, and what I'm going to reiterate, and what any editor worth their salt will reiterate, as well as what every publisher will reiterate to you, is that material that doesn't support your new book's argument has to go. You can use that somewhere else. You can publish it in a journal article. You can put it up on your blog. You can post it on social media if you really want that material out in the world. But if it doesn't support your book's main argument, it's got to go. Another common challenge with the dissertation to book revision process is topic fatigue. Dissertations take a really long time to write. You've been thinking about this topic. You've been working on this topic. Your brain has been mired in this topic for, at this point, more than a decade. That's a long time to be thinking about a single topic, right? So it's extremely common for authors to be pretty damn sick of that topic by the time they get to the revision into a book process. First of all, know that that's completely normal. It doesn't make you a bad scholar. It doesn't even make you a unique scholar. It's completely common. Everyone gets sick of their topic. They do. The important thing is to figure out ways that you can get excited about it in different ways again. One big way to combat this is to write about your topic in other genres. You might blog about it. You might teach it. Teaching it is often a really good way to get excited about your topic again. Because when you're teaching something about your book topic, you have to frame it in a different way. Because your students are not reading the entire book manuscript, right? They're just encountering one little piece of it in some fashion. And so when you're teaching, you have to think about, how can I introduce this teeny little piece of it and provide enough information about this teeny little piece of it and explain enough excitement about this teeny little piece of it so that students can follow my train of thought. And getting your brain to approach your topic in a new way can often get you excited about it again. You can also write new material or add new examples. You might have to do this anyway, depending on how your book manuscript is structured. So you might need to add new examples anyway, but you might just want to add new examples. Maybe your existing example on a specific topic works totally fine, but you're really sick of it. Add a different one. You also might be creating a new frame for your book, right? And chances are you're going to do this anyway. It's usually necessary when making that transition. But focusing on that new frame and viewing your topic through that new frame lets you see it in a different light. And that different angle or that different frame can often get you excited about elements of your topic in ways that you maybe didn't experience in the other frame. And these are a couple ways that you can combat that topic fatigue, which again is totally normal, and you can get through it. Another tricky issue is a reluctance to think of audience. Now, sometimes this is actual reluctance, like I just don't want to care about readers, but usually, and that's not good, but usually it's a lack of understanding about how you're supposed to. So usually it's not actually a reluctance to deal with readers, it's not knowing how to, right? So one way to start to think about this, and this is how I like to advise authors when we're doing editing with them, is to start thinking about why you got excited about the topic in the first place. What got you into this? What pissed you off in the world that made you want to write about it? What made you excited about the world that made you want to write about it? What got your creativity going in the world that made you want to write about this thing? That made you want to spend 10 plus years of your life on this thing? Chances are you had some kind of emotional reason for getting into your topic to begin with. It can be idiosyncratic. It can be silly. It can be dumb, but you had some reason for getting into this and for sticking with it through an extraordinarily long period of time and a lot of student debt, right? Get back to that thing that you got excited about. Sometimes that thing might have changed. That's okay too. But get to that excitement, right? That reason why you care about this thing. Think about how you want this book to change the world. Now, oftentimes, while dissertations tend to have an extremely narrow focus, they often address a very tiny scholarly question or intervene in a very tiny scholarly debate. That's not usually why you got into this topic to begin with. because chances are you got interested in this topic before you ever learned about that tiny scholarly debate or question, right? You had some bigger, broader reason for caring, for thinking that this matters at all. Get big and get bold and get back to that kind of excitement. That is actually a requirement for writing a book anyway, because those reasons why you care about this thing, why you think it matters in the universe, those are reasons why readers should care about this topic. And those are ways that you're going to pitch this book to publishers and other readers. Another tricky issue dealing with revisions from dissertation to book format has to do with a timeline. Now, this is going to entirely depend on your professional situation as well as your personal situation. Oftentimes, if you, for instance, if you're lucky enough to have a tenure track position, first of all, congratulations. You're in the minority, but congratulations. But if you are lucky enough to inhabit a tenure track position, or you're aiming for a tenure track position, you have some pretty hard timelines for revisions. And it's important that you think about that as soon as possible and calculate out exactly how long you do have to revise this manuscript into a book version, submit it to publishers, and go through the very, very long production process. Ask people in your department, ask your department chair, ask the people who are in charge of your tenure case. How long do you have to submit your tenure packet if you're on the tenure track? That's your timeline for revisions and publishing. And you're going to need to calculate out, work backward from that date to figure out when those intermediary deadlines are going to be as well. So if, say, for most university departments, not all of them, but most of them, you have between 5 and 6 years from the date of hire to turn in a tenure packet, right? So that's 5 or 6 years to revise this manuscript into a book version, to write and revise a book proposal, to submit that book proposal to presses, the presses to review that and decide whether they want to see a full manuscript, for them to request your full manuscript, for you to revise your full manuscript and make it ready for publishers, for them to send it out for peer review, for reviewers to review it, which can take quite a long time, for presses to make publishing decisions, and for them to hopefully offer you a contract, and then for the book to go through the production process. Now, when you think about it in those terms, 5 to 6 years starts to seem much shorter, and it is. So it's important that you get crystal clear early on, how long do you have to do this revision process? If you're not on the tenure track and you aren't aiming for a tenure track position, you have a lot more flexibility here, which is pretty awesome. But either way, get clear on how long you have to do this thing. If you're working with a crunched timeline, some ways that you can help yourself out here is you can submit to mid and lower tier publishers as well to increase your publication odds. This is absolutely something that you should check with your departmental colleagues and mentors about, because different publishers, quote unquote, count in different fields in different ways. And your department and your field, specifically the people in charge of your tenure case, are the ones that you need to ask for their advice and follow it, because they're setting the rules, right? So make sure you check with them. Another solution for this is to tackle the parts that need the most work first. I know it's tempting to start with the little nickel and dime stuff because it's easy, because it's like, oh, I can fix that citation over there, or I can add some updated references. But leave that stuff to the end. Number one, because it can happen super quickly. And number two, if you can't get to it, it doesn't really matter compared to some other stuff. But the big stuff, I need a new frame for this project, I need to add 2 more chapters, I need to cut huge amounts of material, those things are going to take longer. Tackle those first. Another solution is to cut material that would take too long to revise. And this is totally common. Oftentimes there'll be a chapter that just needs a ton of revision for it to become appropriate for a book manuscript. And maybe you just don't have time to do that, in which case you just need to cut it. You can also think about reframing the project to fit a different audience. Now make sure that that reframing actually fits the timeline that you need, because you don't want to do a reframing that would actually add time to your timeline if you're feeling a time crunch, right? And then the final kind of tricky issue that everyone revising a dissertation into a book, literally everyone, that they deal with is ghosts. These are advisors. These are that reader two's opinions that just haunt you when you submitted a chapter as a journal article and you got that reader report back and they just tore you apart. Ghosts that haunt your dissertation manuscript include your grad school colleagues, your cohorts. Graduate school is amazing in so many ways, but it's also traumatizing in a lot of ways. And that's not good, but it is common, right? You're not the only one who experiences that. And so dissertations are haunted by those experiences, right? And one of the things that you're going to deal with when you're transitioning from a dissertation manuscript to a book manuscript is reckoning with those ghosts, reckoning with the kind of emotional attachment and response that you have to different sections of that manuscript. And I want you to know that that's totally normal. It's also personal. So what those ghosts are going to depend on your individual situation. And sometimes your editors and your publishers aren't going to be aware of those. And that's okay. You don't need to explain them all, right? But you do need to know when those ghosts are popping up for you and know that that's okay. And then figure out ways to mitigate that. One of the kind of biggest pieces of advice that editors could tell authors who are revising a dissertation manuscript into a book manuscript is that you have permission to be your own person. You're not a student anymore. You don't have to include a damn thing in your book manuscript that you don't want to. And yes, you can include things that maybe an advisor or a dissertation committee member or a chair warned you against including in your dissertation. In the book version, you can include that stuff. It's your book. You are a grown-up scholar by this point, right? It's your book, it's your career. Let's help you make a really great book manuscript that you are proud of, that comes out of what you think is important about this topic, not what someone somewhere down the line back in graduate school had to say about this. Okay, so how can editors help you with this process? Now, editors can mean professional editors. Editors can mean a writing group. Editors can mean acquisitions editors at presses who provide some of this, not all of this material. But editors are people who help you with this revision process. They can help you with things like manuscript critiques and book proposal editing. So provide feedback on the elements in your book proposal. Tell you what what needs to go in that book proposal. They can help with project framing, that new frame that you're creating for this manuscript. They can help you with your argument, identifying whether you have one, identifying if it's a strong one, if you carry it through the text, and how you can improve it. They can provide feedback on and ideas about how to pitch the book to specific audiences, what those audiences might be that would be interested in it. They can offer advice on publication potential. Is this viable as a book? How can we better revise it to make it viable as a book? They can help you with market research, so the kind of competing books that your book would be positioned against. This is a key part of your book proposal. They can help with positioning. And they can also help you identify publishers that would be a good fit for this particular project. Editors can also provide developmental editing at several stages in this revision process. They can provide editing before you send the complete manuscript to the press for peer review. So that would be pre-contract and pre-peer review. So you're getting the manuscript ready to submit to presses. They can also help you implement and respond to reader report suggestions. So that's after the book has gone out for peer review. You have the reader reports back, And the press wants to know how you intend to respond to and incorporate the suggestions that the reader reports provide. Developmental editors can help you with that as well. So that would be pre-contract, so you don't yet have a book contract, but it's post-peer review. They can also help you with copy editing. Copy editing deals with the writing, the nitty-gritty sentence structure, grammar, citation style, all of that stuff. In contrast to developmental editing, which deals with the content, the ideas, the argument. Copy editing can happen on your book proposal. It's a great thing to get on your book proposal, on the cover letter that you submit with your proposal, as well as the sample chapters that you submit with your book proposal. This is pre-submission, right? Copy editing is also useful on the full manuscript itself before you submit the final version. So that would be post-contract. You've already got a book contract, but you need to turn in the final manuscript so it can go into production. And then, as the last stage in the production process, when you get page proofs back, authors are expected to proof their own page proofs or hire a professional editor to do so. And so editors can help you at that stage as well. I put a link on here for our editing page. As I mentioned, Ideas on Fire provides developmental editing, copy editing, proofreading, manuscript critiques, and book proposal editing for scholarly authors. If you have any questions about that process, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A. But I do definitely recommend that you work with someone in some capacity, whether it's your writing group peers, whether it's an acquisitions editor at a press, whether it's a professional editor that you hire, that you work with somebody on this revision process. Primarily because, again, that new emphasis on audience that I was talking about means that other people need to get their eyeballs on this thing. All right. So far, yours have been the primary eyeballs on this manuscript, and that's perfectly fine for a dissertation. But for a book, because you need to be able to pitch it to specific broad audiences, by definition, that's not you, right? It's you plus. So the more eyeballs you can get on this manuscript and the more kind of focused assistance that you can get on this revision process, the better your book's going to be, the better your book proposal is going to be, and the more likelihood you have of getting a book contract and actually seeing the book go into production. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing this and come back, maybe trying. Come on, there we go. Okay, so are there any questions about anything that I've talked about or anything that I didn't get to about the dissertation to book revision process? You can post it in the chat over here, or you can use the Ask a Question function at the bottom of your screen. Doesn't look like there's any questions. Okay, well, that's fine too. The dissertation to book process is, oh, yes. Somebody asks, do we offer copy editing for dissertations? We do. It's because dissertations are academic manuscripts and they're produced for universities. Different universities have different academic integrity rules. And so the editing that we provide to graduate students on their dissertation is in accordance with their university's academic integrity rules. And you can find that out by looking at your university website. It's usually published either in a provost section or an academic integrity section. Different universities organize that differently. But yes, we do provide it as far as it aligns with your university's academic integrity rules. Other questions? Do we have specific proposal editing? Yes, we have a book proposal editing package. So this is something that we often answer with, we often do with authors who are in that process of, they might have revised some of their manuscripts so far, but they're looking to pitch a proposal to publishers. Yes, we provide developmental editing and copy editing on the book proposal draft itself. And we also provide publisher research So we take a look at your manuscript or your proposal, depending on where you are in the process, and then we identify 5 or 6 publishers that would be a good fit for your project, that have strong lists in your field, and that have audiences that match up with your project's audiences. And so we identify those publishers, and we provide you a report with their submission process information, so the different things that you have to include in the book proposal, as well as the timeline of the submission process, as well as contact information for the relevant acquisitions editor on your topic at each press. What's the best way to do both the book proposal and book manuscript? What do you mean? William, I'm not quite sure what your question means. Oh, to work with us. Oh, so it would kind of depend on how much work you've already done on it. So like where in the process you already are. If you have not submitted a book proposal yet to a publisher, I would recommend starting with that, because oftentimes a book proposal, especially if you're like staring at a completed, unrevised dissertation, like that's the stage that you're in, I actually recommend starting with a book proposal. And that's because in a book proposal, you're going to figure out that new frame that your book is going to have. And it's in a shortened version, because a book proposal is about 10 pages, single-spaced. And it's a chance for you to figure out what that new frame is going to be, what the different, sometimes new chapters are going to be. It essentially gives you an outline for the entire project. And you can then use that to revise the manuscript itself, rather than going the other way around. Does that make sense? A book proposal, because we actually have a webinar on book proposals that if you haven't checked out, I highly recommend it, because I talk in depth about what needs to go in a book proposal and how to frame it. But one of the things that you have to include in a book proposal is market analysis and audience analysis. So who will buy this book and how do you know that? And that new kind of frame that I was talking about, that a book version versus a dissertation version needs, because you're thinking about audience oftentimes for the very first time, you have to figure that out in a book proposal anyway. So if you do that first, if you do the book proposal first, and then use that to frame your revisions of the manuscript, you get, number one, that revision process happens faster, and you get a tighter alliance between the book's new argument and frame and the audience that argument and frame is pitched to. Does that make sense? Cool. Other questions? Okay. How do I get permission with my university to have you copy edit the draft of my dissertation? Gotcha. So yes, you would need to check with your university, and different universities, that is the person you're going to check with is going to be different. So I would definitely recommend asking around campus. You could ask your dissertation chair. You could ask other professors in your department or in related departments, and see who you need to check with and what regulations you need to check with about academic integrity. Canadian universities are actually really good about this. They make those rules really easy to find on websites. I wish US universities did this. They don't, unfortunately. But if you're at a university where you don't already know what those rules are, I recommend asking your dissertation chair, asking them what the process is to work with an external editor, copy editor or developmental editor, and if there are any department or university-wide regulations about that. William has a question. What's the best way to contact IOF to work on my manuscript? I'll put our website here. That didn't turn into a link, but you can copy paste that. So that's the page that lists more about our editing services. And there's also a link on that page to submit a project inquiry. Other questions? We're at 2:01, but I'm happy to, and it was supposed to go to 2, but I'm happy to hang out for a couple minutes if there are still questions that folks want answered. Okay. I think we answered them all. Good. So I hope that I didn't scare you off the process of revising your dissertation into a book. I hope I got you excited about it. It is an exciting process. It's pretty damn cool. You get to write a book. And that's much more fun than writing a dissertation. So if you have any lingering questions you find, or there's something that comes up for you that you're like, oh, I wish I had asked, you can contact us through our website, and we're happy to talk with you about editing, about the revision process, about all that good stuff. Oh, Idahan says, I joined the webinar late. What's your name? My name's Cathy Hannabach. I'm the president of Ideas on Fire. And we're an academic editing and consulting agency, and we work with interdisciplinary academics in particular. So thank you all for being here. In about half an hour, you'll get an email from me with a link to the replay of this event. So you can watch the video replay whenever you want. It'll stay up as long as Crowdcast exists, I guess. So you can watch that anytime. And then you'll also get a link to the slides. So you'll get, so you can review those if you have questions or you just want to go back to them later. Our next webinar, we do 2 of these a month. Our next webinar coming up on December 7th is about dealing with rejections. And that's our grad school Rockstars specific webinar. So that's for folks in the Rockstar community. If you are currently a graduate student and not already a Rockstar member, I highly recommend it. It's awesome. You get personalized mentorship and support on the dissertation and graduate school process. And then our webinar after that on December 19th is about money management for graduate students, something that I know I wish I learned more about in graduate school. I wish I had been able to go to workshops about that. So hopefully that will be useful to those of you who are graduate students. And then we're going to take a break because it's the holiday season and it's winter and we want a bit of a break. And then we come back raring to go in the first week of January with more webinars about writing, about publishing, about journal articles, about writing groups, and about a whole bunch of good, fun stuff. So hope to see you at some of those future ones. And thank you for being here. Have a great rest of your day.